Hi everyone, and welcome back to Follow a Researcher. In this week's episode, we're going to introduce you to the work that we'll be doing at the UN climate negotiations, which are called the Conference of the Parties, or the COP, as well as the research that we do when we're not at the UN meetings. And we're going to talk about how all of them connect. My research looks at how people are adapting to the impacts of climate change on their communities. I want to know how countries are talking about climate change at the COP and how these conversations influence climate change adaptation projects taking place in some of these countries. These projects, which we'll talk a little bit more about next, are funded through the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, with money that comes from donations from different countries for projects that take place around the world. To understand why some countries receive these sources of funding, we need to rewind a bit. It all starts with the understanding that some countries have produce more greenhouse gas emissions than others, both at present and historically. If we look at a graph of historic greenhouse gas emissions, we see that countries like the United States and countries across Europe have responsibility for more of the share of emissions for a longer period of time. In contrast, even though the entire continent of Africa, for example, has always had a very small share of emissions, they're still going to be impacted by climate change. So, while many African countries have not caused this problem, they're still being negatively impacted by climate change. These countries have successfully negotiated that the countries that have the historic responsibility for greenhouse gas emissions ought to pay for developing countries to reduce the emissions that they do have, which we call mitigation, and that they should also pay to support projects for countries to adapt to the negative impacts of climate change, which we call adaptation. So, to study how adaptation projects play out, I travel to UN meetings like this fall's trip to Poland, and I also visit different communities in Nicaragua, in Central America, and in Samoa, which is an island in the South Pacific, to observe the different adaptation efforts that are taking place there. Climate adaptations can take many different forms, but in general, they're all efforts to protect communities, infrastructure like roads, bridges, water and energy supplies, and ecosystems from impacts like stronger hurricanes and longer droughts. This type of research is social science research, which is the study of human society and social relationships. To study how adaptation projects are planned and implemented, I use methods like interviewing different people, stakeholders, which include government officials, engineers, residents of the area, funders, and other experts, as well as traveling to different project sites to observe them. For example, at UN meetings, I have talked with country representatives from places such as Nigeria, Iraq, and Bangladesh, and asked them questions about climate change adaptation projects in their countries. When I was in Samoa last summer, I met with government officials to learn about the country's new Community Integrated Management Plan, which specifically focused on dealing with the impacts of sea level rise. Over the course of this season, we are going to talk about different types of data and how they inform our understanding of climate change and human responses to it. So, we want to understand how people can adapt to these impacts of climate change in order to maintain their livelihoods, cultures, and other things important to them.
I'm a glacier scientist. We study glaciers around the world and how they're changing. This is really important because as humans cause more and more greenhouse gas emissions, the world warms and ice melts. As the ice melts, sea level rises around the world. So by understanding how glaciers are changing around the world, we can understand how sea level changes around the world. I use satellite imagery to understand how glaciers are changing. Every day, hundreds of satellites orbit the Earth, monitoring every square inch of the planet. Thanks to these satellites, we have records that monitor how glaciers have changed over the last several decades. These observations allow us to measure changes in glaciers, including velocity or speed, length, and thickness. While satellites provide a really excellent source of data, particularly images, they're insufficient to answer some questions. When we need really high-resolution data, we need to go to the field. When we visit a glacier in person, we can make GPS measurements, take aerial photography, and use other techniques to try to understand the glacier at really high resolution. While we are out on the glacier, we can use a number of techniques to understand change, including ice coring, like you saw in Season 1 with Charles and Kit, and ground-penetrating radar, like you saw in Season 3 with Lynn. Melting glaciers around the world have already caused sea level to increase by 9 inches. However, if all the ice on Earth melts, sea level could rise over 250 feet. This would clearly be devastating for billions of people around the world. Glaciers are also a really important resource for water. People in Norway, Switzerland, Peru, and other places really depend on these glaciers as a source of drinking water and for agriculture. These glaciers can also provide a really important source of water for hydroelectric power generation to keep the lights on. It is really important that we study these glaciers now to understand how they're changing and predict how they'll change in the future. We are particularly concerned about glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica because these are the two places that contain the most ice on Earth. I'm traveling to Poland this December to communicate with international decision makers about our research. It's really important that we explain our basic research on glaciers and climate change to these decision makers so that they have the best information to make decisions about international agreements. This means that my research will inform people that need to understand glacier change. This includes small island nations that are really dependent on sea level rise. As the sea level rise, their islands become uninhabitable, so understanding how quickly glaciers are melting around the world will determine how long they're able to live on their islands. Nations around the world depend on accurate forecasts of glacier melt to be able to adapt to climate change.
We're excited to explore Poland with you when we attend the COP.
Here are some questions for you to think about and discuss over the next week. What questions do you have about the UN climate negotiations?
What do you want to know about glaciers?
What questions do you have about how people are adapting to climate change? Don't miss our next Twitter session.
To ask more questions about our research and the COP.
Thank you for joining us on this season of Follow a Researcher.
From UMaine to the UN.